Elena Rossi sat at her vanity at 6 in the morning, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was impeccably groomed, wearing a silk robe that cost more than most people spend on rent, her dark hair styled even at this early hour because Richard preferred her to look put together at all times. She was 36 years old, and somewhere in the 7 years since she'd married Richard Rossi, she'd stopped recognizing herself. On the nightstand beside her lay a leather-bound notebook, the kind she used to fill with business ideas and market analyses during her MBA program. She picked it up, flipping through pages of concepts she'd developed over the years. Sustainable supply chains for luxury goods. Ethical sourcing models that maintained aspirational branding. Consumer psychology frameworks for marketing environmental responsibility without sacrificing desirability. Ideas that had evolved from academic exercises into sophisticated business strategies, all carefully documented in notebooks Richard had never bothered to open. She could hear him moving around in his dressing room, preparing for another day of real estate deals that he considered infinitely more important than anything she might think or say. In an hour, he'd come downstairs expecting her to have his coffee ready, his breakfast prepared, his schedule confirmed for the social events she was expected to organize. He'd kiss her cheek with the distracted affection one shows a well-trained pet and leave for his office, where Vanessa Chun would be waiting. Vanessa, 28 years old, an investment analyst with a sharp mind and sharper ambition. The woman Richard openly preferred, the woman he compared Elena to at every opportunity, the woman who represented everything Richard claimed Elena lacked. Intelligence, professional success, an understanding of business that went beyond flower arrangements and seating charts. Elena closed the notebook and set it back on the nightstand. She'd been a different person once. A promising MBA graduate with innovative ideas and genuine talent. But Richard had convinced her that her role was different, that her contribution to their marriage should be social rather than professional. She'd believed him because she loved him, because she thought supporting his success was the same as achieving her own. She'd been wrong. Elena descended the stairs of their Westchester home, a beautiful colonial that Richard loved to show off to clients. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, starting the expensive espresso machine, arranging fresh fruit on a plate, toasting the specific bread Richard preferred. The motions were automatic now, her mind elsewhere as she performed the duties of the perfect wife. Richard appeared exactly on schedule, already dressed in a charcoal suit that Elena had picked up from the dry cleaner. He was 42, still handsome in a way that came from money and careful grooming rather than natural genetics. His dark hair was graying at the temples in a way he considered distinguished. His watch cost more than some cars. The Henderson deal is finally moving forward, he announced, not looking at her as he checked his phone. Vanessa had some brilliant insights about the financial structuring. She understands leverage in a way that most people just don't get. That's wonderful, Elena said quietly, setting his coffee in front of him. I'm sure your expertise helped as well. Richard glanced up at her, his expression a mixture of amusement and condescension. My expertise combined with Vanessa's analytical skills. That's what makes a real partnership, Elena. Two people who both bring something valuable to the table. The implication hung in the air between them. Elena brought nothing valuable. Elena was decorative, functional in a domestic sense, but intellectually empty. Elena was not a partner. She was a dependent. I've been thinking about something, Elena ventured, knowing even as she spoke that Richard wouldn't really listen. There's a sustainable luxury conference next month. I was wondering if I might attend. Some of the panels look fascinating, particularly the one on ethical supply chains. Richard laughed, not unkindly, but with the indulgence one shows a child suggesting something adorably naive. Elena, those conferences are for people in the industry. Real business professionals. You'd be bored within the first hour. Besides, we have the Whitmore Charity Gala that weekend, and you need to finalize the arrangements. But I used to study this in my MBA program. I think I could learn something valuable. Your MBA was 10 years ago, sweetheart. Richard stood, adjusting his tie. The business world has changed significantly since then. Vanessa was just explaining to me how much the luxury market has evolved, how sustainability is becoming a competitive advantage rather than a cost center. It's complex stuff, not really something that translates to party planning. He kissed her forehead, missing entirely the way her jaw tightened, the way her hands clenched briefly before she forced them to relax. Elena, Your talents are in making our home beautiful and representing our family well in social settings. That's important work. Not everyone needs to be a business strategist. After he left, Elena sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing. She thought about the woman she'd been at 29. The woman with a prestigious MBA, with professors who'd praised her innovative thinking, with job offers from major consulting firms. The woman who'd chosen love over career, who'd believed Richard when he said her real calling was to be his partner in a different way. That woman had been slowly disappearing for 7 years, replaced by this hollow version who arranged flowers and planned seating charts and pretended not to hear her husband compare her unfavorably to his mistress. Because that's what Vanessa was, even if Richard had never explicitly confirmed it. The late nights at the office, the new cologne, the way he talked about Vanessa with an enthusiasm he'd never shown when discussing Elena. The distance that had grown between them, not just physical but emotional, as if Richard was already halfway out of their marriage while Elena was still desperately trying to hold it together. She opened her laptop, something she rarely did during the day. Richard thought she used it primarily for Pinterest boards and charity event planning. He had no idea that she'd maintained subscriptions to business journals, that she read market analyses and industry reports with the same hungry attention she'd given them in graduate school. He had no idea that her mind was still sharp, still engaged, still developing ideas that went far beyond table settings. Elena pulled up information about the Sustainable Luxury Conference. The speakers included some of the most innovative thinkers in the industry. The panels covered exactly the topics she'd been thinking about for years. The networking opportunities could reconnect her with the professional world she'd left behind. She registered for the conference using money from her small personal account, the settlement from her grandmother's estate that Richard had never bothered to track. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and she was going to use it to invest in herself for the first time in years. The decision felt both terrifying and exhilarating. 3 weeks later, Elena stood in front of her closet trying to decide what to wear to the Whitmore Charity Gala. Richard had made it clear that this event was important for his business connections, that she needed to look impressive without being ostentatious, elegant without being showy. It was a delicate balance he'd taught her over the years, how to present herself as an extension of his success rather than as a person in her own right. She selected a deep blue gown that Richard had approved previously, diamond earrings that had been an anniversary gift, shoes that cost more than she wanted to think about. She styled her hair the way Richard preferred, applied makeup with the precision of someone who'd learned that her appearance was one of the few things about her that her husband still valued. When Richard came home to get ready, he was on the phone with Vanessa. Elena could hear his voice from the bedroom, warm and engaged in a way it never was when he spoke to her anymore. "That's brilliant, Van. You're absolutely right about the zoning implications. I'll bring it up tonight at the gala, see if I can feel out some of the city council members." He paused, listening. "Of course I wish you could be there. These events are so much more interesting when I have someone intelligent to talk to." Elena's hands stilled on her necklace clasp. She stood in front of the mirror, dressed in thousands of dollars worth of carefully selected clothing and jewelry, and felt utterly worthless. Richard appeared in the doorway, ending his call. He looked at Elena with an appraising eye that she recognized. He was evaluating whether she met his standards, whether she would reflect well on him. "The blue is good," he said. "Very elegant. Just remember, the Hendersons will be there, so no mention of anything related to their property dispute. And the Whitmore Foundation Board is nervous about their sustainable initiatives, so if anyone brings up environmental issues, just smile and change the subject. You're not equipped to discuss that kind of thing intelligently." "Of course," Elena said, her voice hollow. They arrived at the gala fashionably late, Elena's hand resting lightly on Richard's arm as they entered the grand ballroom of the Lexington Hotel. The room was filled with the city's elite, the wealthy and the powerful mingling over champagne and hors d'oeuvres that cost more per plate than most families spent on groceries. Elena performed her role flawlessly. She smiled at the right people, made pleasant conversation about safe topics, complimented the wives on their dresses and the husbands on their recent business successes. She was gracious and charming and utterly forgettable, exactly what Richard wanted her to be. She was standing by the bar, waiting for Richard to return from a conversation with a potential investor, when she heard him across the room. His voice carried, louder than he probably intended, amplified by alcohol and arrogance. My wife's expertise is in flower arrangements and seating charts, not business strategy, he was saying to someone. If you want to discuss serious matters, you should talk to Vanessa Chen. She's the one who really understands the complexities of the modern market. Elena turned and saw Richard standing with David Henderson and two other businessmen she recognized from previous events. And beside Richard, looking beautiful and confident in a red dress that was completely inappropriate for a married man's colleague, was Vanessa Chen. Richard had brought his mistress to the event Elena had organized. Vanessa, Richard was saying, has been instrumental in helping me understand the sustainable luxury market. She's the one with the real insights, the actual business acumen to navigate these complex industries. She's built her own investment portfolio, understands risk assessment, knows how to analyze market dynamics. He glanced toward Elena, who stood frozen by the bar. My wife is wonderful at the social aspects, of course, but real business strategy requires a different kind of mind. David Henderson followed Richard's gaze to Elena, his expression uncomfortable. He'd known Elena for years, had watched her transform from the promising young woman Richard had married into this diminished version of herself. He looked like he wanted to say something, but Richard was already steering the group away, Vanessa laughing at something he'd whispered to her. Elena stood there for what felt like an eternity, holding a glass of champagne she didn't remember ordering. Around her, the gala continued, couples dancing, groups laughing, the orchestra playing something elegant and forgettable. She looked down at her blue gown, her expensive jewelry, her perfect hair and makeup, and realized that Richard saw her as nothing more than a decorative accessory that had gone out of style. She set down her glass and walked out of the ballroom. She didn't say goodbye to Richard. She didn't make excuses to the other guests. She simply left, taking a taxi back to their house in a gown that cost $5,000, her diamond earrings glinting in the streetlights. By the time Richard came home at 2 in the morning, smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't hers, Elena had made her decision. The next morning, she was sitting at the kitchen table when Richard came downstairs. He looked tired and vaguely guilty, but mostly annoyed, as if her absence from the gala had been an inconvenience rather than a betrayal. Elena, about last night, he started, but she held up her hand. I'm filing for divorce, she said simply. Richard stared at her. What? I'm filing for divorce. I've already contacted an attorney. Given the prenuptial agreement, this should be relatively straightforward. Elena, don't be ridiculous. Richard's voice shifted into the patronizing tone he used when he thought she was being emotional. I know you were upset about something last night, but walking out of the Whitmore Gala was childish and embarrassing. If this is about Vanessa, you're overreacting. She's a colleague. You publicly humiliated me, Richard. You brought your mistress to an event I organized and told potential business partners that I'm intellectually inadequate while she stood beside you. I was simply being honest about where your strengths lie. You're excellent at the social aspects, but business strategy isn't your forte. That's not an insult, Elena. That's just reality. Elena stood up, and there was something in her posture that made Richard take a step back. The reality, Richard, is that I gave up a promising career to support yours. The reality is that I've spent 7 years being dismissed and diminished while you pursue another woman who you think is more impressive. The reality is that I'm done being treated like an expensive accessory that no longer holds your interest. Elena, you're being dramatic. I've already filed the paperwork. You'll be served today. Richard's expression cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of calculated assessment. Fine, he said coldly. If you want to throw away our marriage over some hurt feelings, that's your choice. But don't expect some massive payout. The prenup is ironclad. You signed away rights to any of my business assets or future earnings. You'll get exactly what we agreed on, which isn't much. I know what I signed, Elena said quietly. I'll take what's mine and nothing more. What's yours is about $500,000 and the guest house. Richard's voice was sharp with satisfaction. Meanwhile, I'll be moving forward with Vanessa, building a future with someone who actually matches my ambition. I hope your flower arranging skills serve you well in whatever small apartment you end up in. Elena didn't respond. She simply walked out of the kitchen, leaving Richard alone with his coffee and his conviction that he'd won something. The divorce proceeded with brutal efficiency. Richard's attorneys made it clear that while he was worth approximately $8 million, much of it was leveraged in property holdings with substantial debt. The prenuptial agreement that Elena had signed 7 years ago, when she was young and in love and certain that money didn't matter, gave her only a modest settlement. She walked away with $500,000, the smaller house on their property that had been converted into a guest residence, and her dignity. Richard, meanwhile, announced his relationship with Vanessa publicly within weeks of the filing. According to mutual friends who still occasionally reached out to Elena, he seemed thrilled to finally be with a real partner, someone who matched his ambition and understood his world. Elena moved into a modest apartment in the city, a one-bedroom place that felt impossibly small after the Westchester estate. She spent the first week unpacking boxes and confronting the reality of her situation. She was 36 years old with a 7-year gap in her professional resume. Her MBA felt ancient and potentially useless. Her ideas about sustainable luxury, carefully developed over years of observation and study, had never been tested in any real marketplace. She had $500,000, which felt simultaneously like a fortune and a terrifying finite resource. She had no career, no professional network, and an ex-husband who was eager to tell anyone who would listen that she'd been nothing but a trophy wife who couldn't understand the complexities of real business. But she also had something else. She had the realization that she'd been living half a life, playing a role Richard had assigned her, suppressing parts of herself to fit his vision of what a wife should be. And now, for the first time in 7 years, she had the freedom to become herself again. The Sustainable Luxury Conference was in 3 weeks. Elena stood in the conference hall of the Metropolitan Center, her notebook in hand, trying not to feel overwhelmed by the crowd of obviously successful, confident professionals around her. Everyone seemed to know each other, greeting old colleagues, exchanging business cards, discussing projects and companies and market strategies. She felt like an imposter, a woman in a modestly priced suit pretending to belong in a world she'd left behind years ago. The first panel was on ethical supply chain management in luxury goods. Elena found a seat toward the middle of the auditorium, far enough back to observe, but close enough to see the speakers clearly. As the panelists began their presentations, she felt something awakening in her that had been dormant for too long. They were discussing exactly the challenges she'd been thinking about for years. The tension between environmental responsibility and aspirational branding. The difficulty of maintaining luxury price points while implementing ethical sourcing. The consumer psychology of marketing sustainability without sacrificing desirability. These were problems she'd studied, concepts she'd developed sophisticated theories about, challenges she believed she understood in ways that went beyond academic frameworks. When the panel opened for questions, Elena's hand went up before she could second-guess herself. The moderator pointed to her. Yes, the woman in the blue blazer. Elena stood, her voice surprisingly steady. Thank you. My question is about the perception gap between sustainable practices and luxury positioning. Traditional luxury branding relies heavily on exclusivity and aspiration, while sustainability often connotes accessibility and democratic values. The panelists have discussed supply chain ethics, but I'm wondering how you address the marketing challenge of maintaining aspirational appeal while promoting what consumers might perceive as an egalitarian message. Specifically, how do you preserve the psychological elements that make luxury goods desirable, things like scarcity, heritage, craftsmanship, while simultaneously marketing environmental responsibility, which fundamentally suggests a concern for collective welfare rather than individual status? The panel members looked at each other, then at Elena, with something like surprise. One of them, a woman in her 50s who ran a sustainable fashion house, leaned forward into her microphone. That's an excellent question, she said. It cuts right to the heart of what many of us struggle with. The short answer is that we're still figuring it out. The longer answer is that it requires a fundamental reframing of what luxury means, shifting from conspicuous consumption to conscious consumption without losing the emotional appeal that drives purchasing decisions. The discussion that followed was animated, the panelists building on Elena's question, exploring the nuances of the challenge she'd identified. Elena sat down, her heart racing, feeling more alive than she had in years. After the panel ended, Elena was gathering her things when someone approached her. He was tall, probably early 40s, with dark hair touched with gray and sharp, intelligent eyes. He wore an expensive suit with the ease of someone who'd long since stopped thinking about his clothing. There was something familiar about him, though Elena couldn't immediately place where she'd seen him before. "That was the smartest question asked in this entire conference," he said, extending his hand. "Adrian Castellano." Elena's breath caught slightly. Adrian Castellano was a legend in sustainable business, a billionaire entrepreneur who'd built a fortune estimated at over $3 billion through ethical luxury brands and sustainable technology. His companies were consistently rated as both highly profitable and genuinely committed to environmental responsibility, a combination most businesses claimed but few achieved. She'd read articles about him, studied his business strategies, never imagining she'd meet him in person. "Elena Rossi," she managed, shaking his hand. "Ms. Rossi, would you be willing to continue that discussion over coffee? I'm genuinely curious about your perspective on the luxury sustainability paradox." Elena hesitated for only a moment, thinking about Richard's voice telling her she wasn't equipped to discuss business intelligently, that her ideas were naive, that she lacked the capacity to understand real market dynamics. Then she thought about the panel's response to her question, about the awakening she'd felt while engaging with these concepts again. "I'd be happy to," she said. They sat in the conference center's cafe, coffee growing cold as they talked for over an hour. Adrian asked questions, really listened to her answers, and responded with insights that both challenged and expanded her thinking. He wanted to know where she'd developed her ideas, what experience she had in the luxury market, why she understood consumer psychology in a way that seemed both intuitive and sophisticated. Elena found herself explaining things she'd never been able to articulate to Richard, how she'd spent 7 years quietly observing the luxury market as a consumer and a society wife, developing theories about what motivated purchasing decisions, how her MBA studies had given her frameworks for analyzing market positioning and brand psychology, how she'd combined formal education with practical observation to develop a nuanced understanding of why people bought luxury goods, and how environmental messaging could be integrated without destroying the core appeal. "You're telling me," Adrian said finally, "that you developed this entire theoretical framework while being a society wife?" Elena smiled slightly, self-deprecating. "My ex-husband would say I was doing flower arrangements and planning seating charts. I'd say I was getting an extended education in luxury consumer behavior from the inside. Your ex-husband is an idiot." The words were said so matter-of-factly that Elena laughed, surprised by the blunt assessment from someone who'd known her less than 2 hours. "Ms. Rossi," Adrian continued, "I'm looking for someone to help expand my sustainable luxury division. Someone who understands both the psychology of luxury branding and the imperatives of environmental responsibility. Someone who can navigate the tension you identified in your question." He leaned forward slightly. "Based on this conversation, I think you might be that person." Elena stared at him. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a consulting position to start. Come work with my team for 3 months, develop strategies for our luxury division expansion, show me what you can do. If it works out, we'll discuss something more permanent. If it doesn't, you'll have been well compensated for your time, and you'll have recent experience for your resume." "Mr. Castellano, I appreciate the offer, but I have to be honest with you. I haven't worked professionally in 7 years. My last position was over a decade ago. I don't have any track record in this industry beyond theories I've developed and ideas I've never had the opportunity to test." Adrian smiled. "Ms. Rossi, I've hired dozens of consultants over the years. Most of them had impressive resumes, prestigious degrees, years of experience. And most of them gave me competent but uninspired work. What I need isn't someone with a perfect resume. I need someone who actually understands this space in a way that goes beyond consulting frameworks. Your question today demonstrated a level of insight that I rarely encounter. That's worth far more to me than a decade of traditional experience. I don't know what to say. Say you'll take the position. Say you'll give yourself a chance to prove what you're capable of." Elena looked at Adrian Castellano, this billionaire entrepreneur who was offering her an opportunity she'd never expected, treating her like she had value, respecting ideas that Richard had dismissed as housewife daydreaming. She thought about the 7 years she'd spent diminishing herself, suppressing her intelligence, pretending to be less than she was. She thought about Richard's voice telling her she lacked the capacity for real business strategy. She thought about Vanessa, held up as the standard Elena could never reach. And then she thought about how it had felt to ask that question today, to engage with these concepts again, to remember who she'd been before she'd agreed to become Richard's decorative wife. "I'll take the position," she said. The first 3 months at Castellano Industries were simultaneously the most challenging and most exhilarating period of Elena's professional life. Adrian assigned her to work with the Sustainable Luxury Division, a segment of his business that included ethical jewelry, sustainable fashion, and eco-conscious home goods. Her role was to develop marketing strategies that maintained aspirational appeal while highlighting environmental responsibility. Elena approached the work with the intensity of someone who knew this might be her only chance to prove herself. She analyzed consumer data, studied competitor positioning, interviewed customers about their luxury purchasing decisions. She stayed late at the office, took work home to her modest apartment, filled notebooks with strategies and frameworks and innovative approaches. But more than that, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Her ideas weren't being dismissed. Her insights weren't being mocked. When she presented concepts, people listened, asked questions, built on her suggestions. Adrian challenged her thinking, pushed her to go deeper, demanded excellence, but he never made her feel stupid or inadequate. He treated her like an intellectual equal, someone whose contributions had genuine value. 6 weeks into her consulting period, Elena presented a comprehensive marketing strategy for the sustainable jewelry line. Her approach focused on repositioning environmental responsibility not as a sacrifice, but as a form of sophistication, suggesting that truly discerning consumers understood that luxury could be both beautiful and ethical. She developed messaging that emphasized craftsmanship, heritage, and exclusivity while subtly integrating sustainability as a marker of refined taste rather than moral obligation. The marketing team loved it. The Sustainable Luxury Division head, Margaret Chun, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd been skeptical of Elena initially, called it the most innovative positioning she'd seen in 20 years in the industry. Adrian was quiet throughout the presentation, his expression thoughtful. When Elena finished, he stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. "This is exactly what I've been looking for," he said finally. "The psychological framework, the messaging strategies, the understanding of how to appeal to luxury consumers without compromising environmental principles. This could transform the entire division." He turned back to Elena. "I want you to lead the expansion, not as a consultant, as the division's director of strategic marketing. Full salary, equity stake, complete authority over the marketing vision." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "Mr. Castellano, that's a significant position. I've only been here 6 weeks. And in 6 weeks, you've developed strategies that my previous consultants couldn't produce in 6 months." Adrian walked back to the conference table. "Elena, I recognize talent when I see it. More importantly, I recognize wasted potential. Your ex-husband spent 7 years overlooking someone who could have been transforming his business. I'm not going to make the same mistake. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me. Just do the work. Show me I'm right about you." Over the following months, Elena flourished in ways she'd never imagined possible. Her marketing strategies for the Sustainable Luxury Division exceeded every projection. Revenue increased by 140% in the first quarter under her direction. Consumer engagement metrics soared. Industry publications began featuring the division as a model for how luxury brands could successfully integrate environmental responsibility. Elena's approach was proving revolutionary not because it was complicated, but because it was insightful. She understood luxury consumers because she'd been one, had spent 7 years in that world observing what drove purchasing decisions. She understood the psychology of aspiration, the emotional appeal of exclusivity, the way certain messaging could make consumers feel sophisticated rather than guilty about their environmental choices. She developed campaigns that repositioned sustainability as a mark of refinement. Advertisements that suggested truly elegant consumers understood that beauty and responsibility weren't contradictory. Marketing materials that emphasized the craftsmanship and artisan partnerships behind ethical sourcing, making environmental commitment seem like insider knowledge rather than mainstream obligation. The work was extraordinary, and Elena knew it. For the first time in her adult life, she was being recognized for her intelligence rather than dismissed for it. She was earning success on her own merits rather than reflected glory from a spouse. She was building something that belonged to her. And Adrian, she discovered, was more than just her employer. He was a genuine mentor, someone who challenged her thinking, provided resources and connections, offered guidance without condescension. He introduced her to industry leaders, invited her to strategic planning meetings, treated her input as valuable in discussions about the entire company's direction. Their professional relationship was built on mutual respect, honest feedback, and shared vision. When Elena's ideas needed refinement, Adrian told her directly, explaining his concerns without making her feel incompetent. When she succeeded, he acknowledged it without excessive praise, simply treating excellence as what he'd expected from her all along. Gradually, imperceptibly at first, their relationship began to shift into something more than professional. It happened in small moments. Adrian laughing at something Elena said, the sound genuine and warm. Elena finding herself looking forward to their strategy sessions not just for the intellectual engagement, but for his presence. Conversations that stretched beyond business topics into personal histories, shared perspectives, mutual understanding. Adrian told her about building his business from nothing, about the challenges of trying to create genuine sustainability in industries that often treated environmental responsibility as mere marketing. Elena talked about her marriage, the slow erosion of her self-worth, the realization that she'd been living half a life. "You're one of the most brilliant strategists I've ever worked with," Adrian told her one evening as they reviewed quarterly reports in his office. "I can't imagine how anyone could have missed that." "My ex-husband saw what he expected to see," Elena said. "A society wife who could make him look good at charity galas. He never bothered to look deeper." "His loss," Adrian said simply. "The business world's gain." The attraction between them was undeniable, but neither acted on it immediately. Elena was still rebuilding herself, still proving that she could succeed independently. Adrian was careful not to let his growing feelings compromise their professional relationship. The last thing Elena needed was to move from one man who defined her worth to another, even if his definition was far more generous. But by the time Elena had been at Castellano Industries for a year, the transformation was complete. She was earning a substantial salary, had been offered equity in the division she'd helped build, and was being courted by other companies who recognized her talent. She'd been featured in industry publications, spoken at conferences, joined advisory boards. She'd become a recognized figure in sustainable luxury business, someone whose ideas were shaping the future of an entire industry. And she no longer needed Adrian's approval or his resources. She'd proven herself beyond any doubt. She had her own success, her own reputation, her own financial security, which meant that when they finally acknowledged their feelings for each other, it was a choice made from strength rather than need. It happened after Elena presented at a major industry conference, 18 months after that first conversation in the cafe. She delivered a keynote address about the future of sustainable luxury that received a standing ovation. Adrian had been in the audience, watching with obvious pride as Elena commanded the stage, her confidence and expertise undeniable. After the presentation, they had dinner at a small Italian restaurant, away from the conference crowds. They talked about the speech, about the division's continued growth, about new strategies Elena was developing. And then, as the meal was ending, Adrian said something that shifted the entire context of their relationship. "Elena, I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that this has nothing to do with your position at the company or our professional relationship." Elena looked at him, her heart suddenly racing. "I'm in love with you," he said simply. "I have been for months, maybe longer, but I didn't want to say anything until you were so established in your success that there could be no question about whether you needed me or chose me." Elena was quiet for a long moment, absorbing words she'd never expected to hear from someone like Adrian Castellano. Finally, she smiled. "I've been waiting for you to say that," she admitted. "I felt the same way, but I needed to know I could do this on my own first. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't just moving from one man who defined me to another. You've proven that beyond any doubt." "I know. That's why I can tell you now that I'm in love with you too." Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, built on the foundation of mutual respect they'd established professionally. Adrian didn't try to rescue Elena or save her or define her worth. He simply appreciated who she was, challenged her to be even better, and partnered with her as an equal. They kept their relationship quiet at first, not from shame, but from a desire to protect Elena's hard-won professional reputation. She'd worked too hard to be reduced to being Adrian Castellano's girlfriend. She needed people to see her as the director who'd transformed the sustainable luxury division, not as the woman dating the CEO. But over time, as Elena's success became even more firmly established, their relationship became more public. And what people saw wasn't a billionaire with a younger partner or a powerful man with arm candy. What they saw was two highly successful individuals who clearly admired and respected each other, who challenged each other intellectually, who'd built something meaningful together professionally before building something meaningful together personally. 2 years after her divorce from Richard, Elena stood in the new headquarters building for Castellano Industries' sustainable luxury division. She was now the division's president, running a business segment worth $400 million. Under her leadership, it had become the company's fastest-growing area, a model for how luxury and sustainability could be successfully integrated. She'd been featured on the cover of Business Excellence magazine as one of the most innovative executives in sustainable luxury. Her strategies were being taught at business schools. Her insights were shaping industry standards. The naive ideas Richard had mocked were now considered pioneering. Elena looked out at the city from her corner office, thinking about the journey from Richard's guest house to this moment. She'd rebuilt her entire life from the ground up. She'd proven her worth not to Richard or to anyone else, but to herself. She'd discovered that her talent was real, that her intelligence was valuable, that her ideas could transform an entire industry. Her phone rang. It was Adrian, calling from Tokyo where he was meeting with potential partners for a new sustainable technology venture. "How's the market analysis going?" he asked, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "We're going to exceed projections again this quarter," she said. "The new artisan cooperative partnerships are performing even better than expected." They talked for 20 minutes about business, about strategies, about challenges and opportunities. And then, before ending the call, Adrian said something that made Elena's heart warm. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not as your partner or as the company's CEO, but as someone who recognizes genuine excellence when I see it. You've built something extraordinary, Elena." "We've built something extraordinary," she corrected gently. "No," Adrian said firmly. "You built this. I just gave you the opportunity to show everyone what I already knew. That you're brilliant." After they ended the call, Elena returned to the financial reports on her desk. She had a board meeting the next day where she'd be presenting expansion plans for the division. She had 3 speaking engagements scheduled for the next month. She had a team of talented people who looked to her for leadership and vision. She had built a life that was entirely her own. The encounter happened at an industry event 3 months later. Elena arrived with Adrian, both of them dressed impeccably, carrying themselves with the confidence of people who knew their own worth. The event was a celebration of ethical business practices, hosted by a major environmental foundation. Elena had been invited as a keynote speaker. She was reviewing her notes when she heard a familiar voice. "Elena?" She turned and found herself facing Richard for the first time since their divorce. He looked older, the distinguished gray hair now looking more tired than elegant. His suit was expensive but not quite as perfectly tailored as she remembered. He looked like a man under stress, someone struggling to maintain appearances. Next to him was Vanessa, who appeared uncomfortable in a way that suggested their relationship wasn't quite the partnership of equals Richard had promised himself. "Richard," Elena said calmly. "Vanessa, I saw your photograph in Business Excellence magazine," Richard said, and there was something in his voice Elena couldn't quite identify. Defensive, almost bitter. "You're running Castellano's sustainable luxury division?" "I'm the division president, yes." Richard looked at Adrian, who had moved to stand beside Elena. The recognition was immediate, the realization of who Elena's partner was, what that meant about her current position in the business world. "And you're working for Adrian Castellano?" Richard said. "I'm not working for anyone," Adrian interrupted smoothly, before Elena could respond. "Elena is the president of a $400 million division of my company. She's one of the most brilliant strategists I've ever encountered. I consider myself fortunate that she accepted my offer to lead our sustainable luxury expansion." Richard's face went pale. "For $100 million? Elena," Adrian continued, his voice cool and professional, "has transformed our entire approach to sustainable luxury branding. Her strategies have become industry standard. She's revolutionized how we think about marketing environmental responsibility while maintaining aspirational appeal." Elena looked at Richard, this man who'd spent 7 years dismissing her intelligence, mocking her ideas, treating her like she was intellectually inadequate. She thought about all the times he'd compared her unfavorably to Vanessa, told her she lacked business acumen, suggested her only value was in flower arrangements and seating charts. Those ideas you used to call naive, Richard, Elena said quietly, about sustainability in luxury markets? They're now generating more revenue than your entire property portfolio. And those strategies you said I couldn't possibly understand? They're being taught at business schools. She paused, letting the full impact sink in. Turns out I understood business quite a bit better than you gave me credit for. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked from Elena to Adrian and back again, and Elena could see him recalculating everything he believed about his ex-wife, about his own superior judgment, about what he'd lost when he'd chosen Vanessa over his marriage. We should go, Vanessa said quietly, touching Richard's arm. He's expecting us at the Hendersons. Richard nodded but didn't move immediately. He looked at Elena one more time, and she saw it clearly in his expression. The realization that he did everything he claimed to want in a partner and never bothered to notice. The understanding that his entire assessment of his marriage had been fundamentally wrong. The dawning comprehension that his ex-wife's naive ideas were worth more than his entire net worth. It was nice seeing you, Elena, he said finally, his voice hollow. After they left, Adrian looked at Elena. Are you all right? I'm perfect, she said, and meant it completely. 3 months later, Elena delivered her keynote address at the Environmental Foundation's annual conference. She spoke about building sustainable luxury brands, about the psychology of ethical consumption, about how businesses could succeed financially while operating responsibly. The audience included leaders from major corporations, environmental activists, policymakers, and entrepreneurs building the next generation of sustainable businesses. Adrian sat in the audience, watching her command the stage, and felt nothing but pride for this woman who'd rebuilt her entire life, who'd proven her worth against all the doubt and dismissal she'd faced. After the speech, during the reception, a young woman approached Elena. She looked nervous, clutching a business card in her hand. Ms. Rossi, I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to tell you how much your speech meant to me, she said. I have an MBA, but I gave up my career 3 years ago to support my husband's business. I've been thinking lately about whether I made the right choice, and hearing your story tonight made me realize that it's not too late to find my way back. Elena took the young woman's card, saw the email address written on the back in careful handwriting. She thought about herself 2 years ago, sitting in a small apartment wondering if she'd ever use her education again, terrified that 7 years away from professional life had made her irrelevant. It's never too late, Elena told the woman gently. Your talent doesn't disappear just because someone fails to recognize it. Sometimes you just need the right opportunity to remind yourself what you're capable of. After the woman left, Adrian came to stand beside Elena. You're inspiring people, he said. I'm just telling them what I learned, Elena replied. That your worth doesn't depend on anyone else's ability to see it. She looked around the reception, at all these successful people who now sought her advice, valued her insights, recognized her expertise. She thought about Richard, struggling with his leveraged properties and his marriage to a woman who'd wanted his wealth more than his character. She thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago and the woman she'd become. The greatest victory, Elena realized, wasn't proving Richard wrong about her intelligence or her capacity for business success. The greatest victory was discovering that she'd never needed his approval or his recognition in the first place. She'd always had the talent, the intelligence, the innovative thinking. She just needed to stop suppressing it to fit someone else's limited vision of who she should be. In the end, Richard's dismissal had actually given her a gift. It had pushed her to the breaking point where she had to choose between continuing to diminish herself or reclaiming her own potential. And she'd chosen herself. She'd chosen to be brilliant, to be ambitious, to be everything Richard had claimed she could never be. And now, standing in a ballroom full of people who respected her expertise, with Adrian beside her as a genuine partner, running a $400 million division she'd built through her own intelligence and hard work, Elena understood the most important lesson of all. She'd never been the inadequate wife Richard had made her feel like. She'd been a talented professional suppressing her abilities to support a man who couldn't recognize what he had. And the moment she stopped suppressing herself, stopped diminishing her own capabilities, stopped accepting someone else's limited assessment of her worth, she'd become unstoppable. Richard had looked at her and seen nothing but flower arrangements and seating charts because he'd never bothered to look deeper. Adrian had asked one question at a conference and immediately recognized the brilliant mind she'd been hiding for years. The difference wasn't in Elena. She'd been the same person all along. The difference was in who was willing to actually pay attention. And now, finally, Elena was paying attention too. To her own abilities, her own potential, her own worth. And that changed everything.